Hello, and welcome to the Right Mind podcast, brought to you by the Institute of European Right. I'm your host, Teodoras Žukas, and I'll be guiding today's conversation. It is my pleasure to introduce our today's guest. Joshua Livestro is a Dutch historian and political commentator with a wide experience in various positions in politics. He worked for two former prime ministers, UK Prime Minister Theresa May and Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte. Currently, Joshua Livestro is a member of the Europe panel of the Dutch Foreign Office Advisory Council on International Affairs. Most recently, Joshua Livestro published a book titled A More Perfect Union, Federal Union in Political Theory and Practice with Amsterdam University Press. And the book itself will be the main focus of our talk. Joshua Livestro, thank you for being at our podcast.
Well, thank you for your kind introduction and for the opportunity to be here.
Yes, brilliant. So the first question, generally, the main focus and area of a book itself is the, as I understand, the history of the attempts to create a federal union, federal European political body, from where we could trace the first attempt, the very first attempt in perhaps modern or pre-modern history to create the unified political body in Europe.
Yeah. To turn the question on its head slightly, and I'll tell you what my fascination with the topic was and how I came to write this book, was that I was struck by the sort of implausibility of the standard idea of how European unification came about, that it was strictly an answer to the events of World War II and its immediate aftermath, that it, like Venus, it came out of the waves fully formed, no prehistory. And as a historian, that always struck me as somewhat unlikely. No idea comes about like that normally. It always responds to certain things, and generally it has a prehistory of some sorts in a different form. And so I started picking up the thread of it and ended up tracing it all the way back to Niccolo Machiavelli, who develops the first theoretical framework for what we could call a type of federal union, which he calls a league, which he develops in his other famous book, The Discourses on the First 10 Books of Titus Livy. Obviously the main one being The Prince, where he refers to the idea more obliquely a few times. Machiavelli in his writing refers mainly to the example of the Swiss as a contemporary one, and to what he calls the German one, which is clearly the Holy Roman Empire, which he saw as a federation. Came as a surprise to me, but it turned out that generally in the entire early modern period which follows, those two, together with the Dutch United Provinces and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, were seen as the four great federal bodies of the early modern period. And together they spanned about half the territory of continental Europe. So it was not surprising that they also dominated discussions in the United States, where the first, as it were, quasi-European federal union on a continental scale is formed. At least I say quasi-European because it's obviously the other side of the Atlantic, but it's at least directly inspired by the Europeans. First, as a positive example, in 1777, when they formed their union based on the Articles of Confederation, and then negatively when they want to correct all the mistakes of the European model in 1787, when they form a more perfect union. But then to answer your question more directly, the earliest European continental models is that of 1815, of the Peace Treaty of Paris, developed into the Congress of Vienna. And it's a very imperfect union because it doesn't really have a shared desire on the part of the member states to make it work, nor does it have institutions that can correct this. So it lasts only 10 years, but it lives on in the imagination, mainly as a negative example, but later in 1919 at the negotiations in Paris as a second, as a slightly more positive model. And obviously the complication is then that we have to bring in other countries from outside it, but events in America quickly reduce it to a more European rump body, the League of Nations. Now that had many obvious flaws, one of which was that actually the Europeans couldn't sort out their European problems inside it without getting into trouble with non-European member states, because they are paying their dues. Why can't they have a say when issues are discussed? So this issue they tried to resolve around 1930, when the French Foreign Secretary Aristide Briand comes up with a proposal for a United States of Europe. That attempt fails, but that idea stays on the mind of those who are charged with the reconstruction of Europe after the war, and that's how eventually the idea ends up forming an integral part of the discussions. So that is the thread that I've traced in the book all the way from Machiavelli to the immediate post-war period.
The 1815 and the Congress of Vienna, I'm really happy that you mentioned that. This is the issue which I had an opportunity to dwell into during my academic years in the university. In the what would you say were the main obstacles for the system created in Vienna? We know the Quadruple Alliance, the Holy Alliance, the other one, the so-called Metternich system, and the Congress system. Kissinger, we know that was very, very influenced by the phenomena itself. He wrote perhaps his PhD thesis, I think, about the system itself. What were the main obstacles for the system of Vienna, the Congress system, to have more long years to have more influence throughout the 19th century?
Well, I think you can identify three weaknesses or sort of structural flaws that made it very unlikely that it was going to survive in the long term. One was, as I said, the fact that those participating didn't really have a shared sense of destiny. That's always a challenge in federal unions, because obviously they consist of individual entities that all have their own priorities going into any discussion. But here, for some of the participating states, it was even a question of whether they really wanted to be in it or not. Especially the English had at best half a mind on participation. They had an internal struggle that was resolved in favor of those who wanted to undermine the system or basically leave it behind, when Lord Castlereagh, the English Foreign Secretary, committed suicide and was then replaced by what Metternich described as the malevolent meteor George Canning. Canning really took a wrecking ball to it. But that Canning could take a wrecking ball to it because, as I said, it also failed to develop strong institutions that could help it withstand these sort of internal upheavals. One thing that any federal union always faces as a challenge is how can we make sure that we survive from, not just from day to day and year to year, but from generation to generation. And that is done through the building of institutions that can safeguard the continuity of it. That didn't happen, and that meant that when personnel changes happened, it fell apart very quickly in the early mid-1820s. Probably a third element is a more, you could call it ideological one, but in my view, the brilliance of the Congress system and in a sense also of the Holy Alliance, is that it introduced an entirely new concept of peace, of maintaining peace. Previously, in the 18th century and second half 17th century, the order on the continent was based on the idea of the balance of power. And the balance of power has as its internal logic warfare. That is the way you resolve conflicts, and then you formalize that resolution in peace treaties, but they only cover the war that had been. And they never looked forward. They didn't settle anything permanently, even between the parties in a peace treaty. And what the Vienna system introduced was a more prospective concept of peace. So they introduced a method for maintaining peace, for preventing conflict. So peace rather than war became the logical basis for discussions. But fundamentally, the parties involved remained attached to the balance of power system. They were constantly looking for ways around the control of the group to continue their own policy of using warfare to settle conflicts or to impose their will on unwilling neighbors, for example, in the case of the French in Spain. Because they couldn't resolve that, in the end they returned to a form of it. So the Congress system is replaced by the concert system, which is really the balance of power by other means, but with a slight correction that they hold on to the idea of periodic conferences where they do resolve some issues before they get out of hand. So it's a slight correction on what came before, but not a fundamental one. And so we were stuck with the same fundamental problem that periodically a war would break out that would suck all the major powers into it. At times we survived, like for example in the war Crimea in the mid-1850s. But in the second decade of the 20th century, as we all know, things went horribly wrong eventually. Now, unlike Kissinger, I'm not a fan of the balance of power. I think it's vital that we recognize it for what it is. We talk a lot about it now because we are looking for a new model to replace the Pax Americana. But I think we need to learn the lesson from centuries of experience with and also thinking about the balance of power, and recognize that its internal logic really is one of warfare, and it's one that we want to avoid at all cost, as we see now in Ukraine. And so rather than a balance, I am all in favor of an unbalance. We need to be so powerful, so overwhelmingly well-armed, that no other power would ever contemplate harming any of our interests or provoking a conflict with us.
You mentioned, we've talked already about the Congress of Vienna system. You mentioned what the statesmen in Europe tried to create after the First World War in Versailles. My question is about whether the European Union's founding fathers, Robert Schuman, Altiero de Gasperi, and all the other great statesmen were aware, let's say, on the theoretical basis, on the historical basis, aware of the whole background of the attempts to create the, let's say, federalized Europe.
Yes, and this was one of the surprises for me because obviously I ended the book with a section on that debate post-war, and did a first deep dive into the autobiographies and the correspondence of the people involved. And I had no real expectation of them having a memory of it, but it is overwhelmingly present actually in their writings and in their speeches. most directly in the case of Schumann, who, when he gives a speech on the occasion of the launch of the Council of Europe, which is at the time the main systemic alternative to what later would be the European Coal and Steel Community, a union that was fully based on the sovereignty of the member states, so no real sovereignty for the center. He says that, well, he recognizes that it perhaps has certain weaknesses, but it delivers a centuries-old dream. And then he mentions specific examples and a number of thinkers that are associated with this tradition, from Saint Pierre and Kant to Aristide Briand. So it's in his work, this European tradition is directly present. In the case of Monet, who was not an academic, but really a man of action, you would have not expected any kind of sort of intellectual reflection on it. He would just see the problems in front of him and try to solve him. But he too had a historical source of inspiration, and that was the American founding. He looked at that as a direct source of inspiration. He was not the only one. Obviously, you will be familiar with the Veto Manifesto, and perhaps the work of an English economist like Lionel Robbins, who was a source of inspiration for Ventotene again, where the American model of 1787 was really sort of put at the heart of all thinking about European integration, which is interesting sort of turn of events, because obviously the European experiences of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, among others, had been the source of inspiration for the Americans. Now the Americans, in turn, and their more perfect union, inspired people like Monet after the war, who thought, well, we don't want to build a kind of union like the one we just had, like the League of Nations, that ran into the veto problem, where we had no way of resolving inner conflicts or even to get the union, or the league as it was, to take decisive action on any problem. And that really manifested itself in the 1930s, right, with a number of crises, the Abyssinian one, and Manchuria, where they were effectively powerless to impose their will on people. And so he said, right, we need to think deeply about the fundamental problem, which is the one of sovereignty. If we leave full sovereignty with the member states, we're never going to resolve this issue. And then that he specifically looked to the American experience, because they had found a way of resolving this problem. They had found a way of sharing sovereignty between the center and the member states. And that is also the model, in the end, that inspires the sort of construct that they create in the negotiations about the European Coal and Steel Community.
What were the, if we were to remain on this historical part of the picture, what were the main intellectual figures of this idea of the unified Europe? You mentioned Abbé de Saint-Pierre, as I understand, Immanuel Kant. What were the main? Well, Machiavelli, of course, you mentioned.
Yeah. Well, intellectually, the high period of theoretical development is the 18th century, when there is quite a lively debate among the great thinkers of the time, starting with Saint-Pierre, about the question of whether it's possible to unite all the powers of Europe in a single Congress, whether it is desirable to do so. And in that debate, you roughly had two camps. One was the ones who argued that, well, we want to create a union of sorts, but we want it based on the balance of power. So where conflicts are settled through warfare, as I had observed, and where you have a sort of continuum that goes all the way from out-and-out warfare to simple diplomatic solutions. And its legislation was the various peace treaties that help settle all the conflicts, and that becomes a sort of body of jurisprudence almost between nations. Against that, and the main names associated with that are Aimé de Vatel, the great sort of thinker of the sort of second half of the century, and Voltaire, whose life overlaps partly with Vatel, but who's seen really as more part of the first half of the 18th century, and they take up arms mainly against the writing of Saint-Pierre, and that then provokes a response first by Rousseau. And Rousseau is a bit of a complex figure in this one, because he says, well, it is desirable, let's be honest. If we look at all the bloodshed that it could help to prevent, then we can quickly agree that a method based on perpetual peace is much to be preferred. It's preferred for all around. But he said there is a fundamental problem in that the people who have to sign this treaty, the monarchs, may have a clear interest in it, but they think that there is a different logic, namely the one of honor, that compels them to reject it, because honor can only be furthered in conflict. And he said that means that we have only one way of establishing it, and that is through a war of all against all, a great war, the final war, which would settle it all and could clear the way for perpetual peace. But he said the price is so great in that case, in terms of cost of lives and economic destruction, that it's probably better not to strive for it. And so, though what we have is imperfect, we'll have to live with it, because the alternative is worse. That then is answered by Immanuel Kant, who recognizes that as a challenge. And so Immanuel Kant is the origin of an interesting European, specifically European tradition of gradualism or incrementalism. He recognizes that if you start with too high a level of ambition, then really the war of all against all is what you end up with. And to prevent that, the best thing you can do is find a small group of like-minded countries and build from there. And he introduces one highly relevant criterion for it, namely that they have to be what he says republics. That could be a monarchy, but it had to be a monarchy based on the idea of separation of powers. And these two ideas, gradualism and the idea of separation of powers, both really get attached fundamentally to the European idea of federalism, and in fact end up again in the finally adopted construct of the ECSC, right, which is also a small group, a vanguard of countries, and is based on separation of powers. But oddly enough, it was only after they had tried, at least at the theoretical level, other alternatives like the American one of the Big Bang all at once. When they tried that through the Council of Europe, and that failed, they ended up with the Kantian alternative.
Moving on to today's, let's say challenges. Brexit already is not a is not a challenger, but a fact already. Yes, a democratic backsliding in the let's say the rise of populism in most of the European Union countries. External threats, mainly Russia, right? In your view, how might let's say this federal tradition could help us understand or navigate through today's crisis?
Well, understand it, at least in this way, that the sort of what we could call the American compromise, which is also the European compromise at the heart of this structure, is one between the center and the member states. Now, a federal union is a living entity. It's not something that's cast in stone. So at any time, you have conflicts horizontally, as it were, between the institutions, so between the parliament and the commission and the courts, and vertically between the center and the member states. There's a tug of war going on all the time. You could liken it to the balance of power, only it's been institutionalized and politicized. So it's not a warfare anymore, it's a political process. But within that, it's a permanent reality that the member states will try to increase their scope for action and their say as much as possible. And at the same time, the center will try to do the same. So you have a constant pulling of the elastic. And in some cases, that elastic then eventually snaps, like in the case of the Brits. In the Hungarian case, well, it's evident that that Orban really doesn't want to leave. Right? If he had plenty of opportunities to do so, but he wants to stay in it, but he wants to use his position to weaken the union. He wants to go back to a union of fully sovereign member states, which is a model that we've tried again and again in history and it always fails. It's probably why he wants to try it, but that's another matter. But yeah, it's a challenge how you deal with that. But it's not an unusual challenge. Historically, this is the norm. Fully harmonious relationships where the states all hold hands and sing songs of praise for the center, and the center repays that with acts of kindness, have never happened. Look at the American experience, where they had to fight at least one civil war, and where after that, really, the South became an entity in itself with its own legal framework that was in no way compliant with that of the center. Yeah, the challenge is somehow to maintain unity in spite of all of that. And that then brings you to what is the core virtue of federal unions throughout history. And that is, the art of compromise, of maintaining a sense of unity, concordia, right, and the classical tradition. Sometimes that's difficult. Like, how do we deal now with the Hungarian problem? Well, the rest of us are now working actively on developing ways of working around it. Not excising the Hungarians or booting them out of the union, but finding ways of stopping them from being an obstacle. And I think there, a reflection on the past, for example, on the case of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, can be helpful, because it helps us to understand more fully the problems that we're dealing with, which is especially the problem of the veto power, of course. If it doesn't immediately produce a solution in the past, even I suppose maybe the Constitution of 1791, but it does at least help us to get a much firmer grasp of the problem that we're facing and the need to tackle this in a fundamental way.
You would think that the veto issue, if I may call it like that, is the biggest challenge now for inside the European Union in terms of institutional issues?
It's one of them, yes. I mean, a federal union at any particular time always has several. I mean, the Americans at the moment have a completely different one. In a way, you could say their problem is that the member states of that union don't have a veto power over the decisions of the center. And so the center has become too powerful, in a sense. Now, that worked previously because the center was internally divided, politically and also institutionally. But now one man, through his party, controls all the levers of government, and he's starting to impose his will on unwilling states. Like in the case of Maine, he's just withholding funds unless the governor there is willing to prostrate herself before him and apologize for not being nice to him. In our case, the veto power of the states is a problem of too much. So in any situation, we have to look for ways to create checks and balances between the various parts of the governing structure that we've created. But you're always going to face problems that one part of it is malfunctioning, and then you have to be jointly committed to fixing that problem. And at the moment, at the European level, it's the veto power, and it's quite concretely the veto power in the area that affects us the most. It's also one of the few areas of veto power left, right? The foreign and security policy. But it's a real challenge. But it's also work in progress. It's not like we are not aware of it, and as if we're not actively looking for solutions to it. The question is always, do you have time?
Would you have some other ideas where the current European Union, in terms of institutional structure, should implement reforms in order to strengthen the, as Americans call it, the State of the Union?
Yeah. Well, from the constitutional perspective, there is one sort of serious imbalance, and that is the position of the Council of Heads of Government. Not the Council of Ministers, because that functions largely inside a structure where QMV, qualified majority voting, is the rule. But there is no real check on the power of the Council. And constitutionally, that is undesirable, generally, because it means that at some point it can become too powerful, as it were. Now, in the past crises, that has been useful. Say, since 2008, we've been able to solve crises through the Council structure when we couldn't do it through our normal institutional structure. But as with all things, too much of a good thing can become a problem at some point, because you rely entirely upon the composition of the Council. And so we have to find a solution for that, I think. It's not straightforward how to do that. Directly elect the members, for example, or give the Parliament, which represents the people of Europe as a whole, some counterweight against the Council. But it's clear that something needs to be done there. It's not the only issue. Another issue, which is, I think, probably a permanent challenge, is that we need to make sure that a shared sense of destiny, as it were, and perhaps something that you could call a European civic culture, is maintained not just at the level of the Council and the Parliament, so in these political institutions where people actually have dealings with each other, but at the level of the population, or populations, because we still talk about peoples of Europe, plural. And perhaps in the longer run, we want to have the ambition to develop a single European people. We are, after all citizens of Europe. And that is, I think, mainly a matter of education, of investment in culture, and of long and hard thought and debate.
Reflecting on the Brexit process that happened, and mainly about the negotiations between the European Union and the United Kingdom at that time, in 2015, then 2016. As I understand, you were part of a you had some kind of a role in that. You were following the issue. You were following the issue itself. Would you think that there were something that could have been done differently from the part of European Union on behalf of the United Kingdom, or whether that was just sort of inevitably the end itself?
Yeah. What could have been done differently is that Cameron should never have gone for the referendum, because it opened a Pandora's box, obviously. what could have been done differently after that is that the population that later came out onto the streets to demonstrate for the return of the rights that they had just lost, the liberties, the European liberties, should have been more awake to the fact that they were actually at stake. That is something. I think once it came to the negotiating stage of Brexit, it is very difficult to imagine a different outcome. We could have settled for a sort of customs union type involvement for the Brits. That right now that would have benefited them. I know that the Irish are in favor of reopening that discussion. I can't see it happening. But the problem is that once they decided to leave, staying in the single market or the customs union made very little sense, because then they would have been rule takers. And the whole point of Brexit was that they wanted to restore their full sovereignty. That leaves you isolated, and in a crisis like this one, relatively weakened. But it is all your own say. That is, I suppose, what the naysayers wanted in this particular case. But I was not necessarily much involved, but I did visit Downing Street shortly after the Brexit vote, when I spoke to one of my conservative friends there, who was later part of the Brexit negotiating team, and he already in August, I think, of 2016 sketched the structure of the final deal that would come out, because it was logical that it would end up there with a more or less a full, or what we call hard Brexit, because realistically none of the softer alternatives made political sense.
And then the final question: if the readers in general, the listeners of our podcast, were to take one big idea from your book that we've talked about, what would it be? The main message of your book?
It is, don't take the existence of a federal union for granted. People time and again have made that mistake in history of thinking that what exists will always exist. The European Union, such as it is a tremendous accomplishment. It is also, therefore, something to greatly treasure. We have our freedoms, our prosperity, and in part also our security to thank to it. We can do more through it. It can certainly become a more perfect union than it is today, but it will also only have a chance to become that if we all remain fully committed to it, if we are all willing to defend it. And that defense is as important now as it has ever been, because there are forces on our doorstep that actively seek to undermine it, to weaken it, and eventually just to smash it up. And that threat now comes from both sides of the Atlantic. So there is no time like the present to take up that defense.
Mr. Livestro, thank you for being at our podcast. That wraps up today's episode of A Right Mind podcast. We have had the privilege of speaking with Joshua Livestro, a policy advisor and author of a book, A More Perfect Union. If you enjoyed this conversation, be sure to follow the Institute of European Right on Facebook, LinkedIn, X, and Blue Sky for more insights and updates. Thank you. Bye-bye.